It now gives me great pleasure to welcome our guest speaker this evening, Dr. Campbell Miles. I should add, by the way, that I think we're in safe hands tonight. We have I was about to say volcanologist, but you know I mean vascular surgeon. A surgeon who deals with the heart. A surgeon who deals with, David, what are you? And then another general medicine doctor. So we're surrounded by doctors. So if anybody, has a particular vascular or cardiac problem, just put your hand up. Well, we've got a man for that too somewhere. There it is. As you may have read in the earlier advertising flyer, Dr. Miles has been a prominent surgeon in Melbourne for many years, most recently as the head of vascular surgery at the Alfred Hospital. He has spent time working with the Air Force on secondment, if you like. So he's got Air Force experience. Peter Habsburger has naval experience. Our other colleague over here, visitor, has got Army experience, I understand, and then of course more Navy up the back. So we're well and truly a tri-service medical evening. But Cameron is now retired. He describes himself as having an interest in the interrelationships between medicine, military actions, and society. He was a very active member of the section of medical history at the Royal Australian College of Surgeons for 15 years. So I guess we'll learn shortly how that all translated into his knowledge of this fascinating topic, scurvy, and how it was cured in the Royal Navy, which has benefited naval forces obviously for many years hence thereafter. So please join me in a warm welcome to Dr. Campbell Miles.
Just forward backwards. Yeah, thank you to Andrew for your kind invitation. And I did, when I looked up the address in the calendar, I realised it was school holidays, so I thought there'd be about 6 people here. So I'll be able to speak freely because there'll be no experts in the audience likely to contradict me. But it turns out that, in fact, I'm confronted by a sizable audience. And as I did say to one of your members, if I see anybody dozing, I will ask a question of you, and that will help to keep you awake, or at least keeping your eyes open, even though you may be mentally travelling. So my topic this evening is the defeat of scurvy in the British Navy in the near 50 years between 1753 and 1795. Now, scurvy was not a new disease. It was recognised in Europe, particularly in Central Europe at the end of long, hard winters, and even in northern Scotland in the long, hard winters, due to a lack of fresh vegetable material. We now understand, although it wasn't known then what that was. But the real problem that emerged, of course, was scurvy as it affected the navies, particularly the navies of Western Europe. It emerged with an appalling death rate, a high level of invalidity on the ships as well, as the Western European nations with access to the Atlantic undertook, if you like, 2 areas of particular expansion. The first one was the development of the technology of how to build a wooden ship that could travel overseas on the oceans for protracted periods of time. Up until this, we're talking about much smaller vessels, perhaps used by the Romans and the Greeks in the Mediterranean, galleys. They didn't have any of these issues. They weren't at sea for any long periods of time. But once the European nations, as I say, particularly Western Europe and those with access to the Atlantic, had developed the technology to allow them to undertake these long voyages, it happened to coincide with an economic desire to undertake long voyages. And the common thread was for these Western European nations to overcome the stranglehold that the Venetian Empire had over the spice trade. So the reason that Christopher Columbus, on behalf of the King and Queen of Spain, headed west across the Atlantic in 1792 was to get to the Spice Islands, what we call Southeast Asia, to escape the clutches of those voracious tradesmen in Venice who controlled the overland spice routes. Likewise, Henry the Navigator of Portugal was sending people like Vasco da Gama south to take an easterly route around what became the Cape of Good Hope in order to have the same destination, to get to Zanzibar and to get to the Spice Islands of what we now call Southeast Asia. So it was the combination of the technological advance that allowed people to build these ships and an economic desire to overcome the control of the Venetian Empire that drove the desire for these protracted ocean voyages. And of course, as mercantile activity at that stage and that era, even now, develops, once a country had an economic reason for developing colonies, for example, or trading posts in Southeast Asia, they had to protect those trading posts and their merchant marine. The Navy had to follow soon afterwards in order to provide protection. And there were significant naval battles between the Portuguese and the Dutch, and between the Dutch and the English, as the navies of those countries attempted to protect their merchant marine as they opened up the spice trade from Southeast Asia. So once those long journeys developed, then it was going to be apparent that in fact this dreadful disease of scurvy was going to occur. So that's the background to why what we're talking about happened toward the end of the 1400s and into the 1500s. And for a long period there was the acceptance that if you went to sea for long periods, a large percentage of your seamen were going to die from scurvy. I'd just like to give a little bit of background though to the condition of scurvy and what it is. You're all familiar with it, you're a very intelligent audience, I discover from talking to people at pre-dinner drinks. But it is basically a deficiency of an essential vitamin, vitamin C, or to give it its correct biochemical name, ascorbic acid. And ascorbic acid is basically a portmanteau word made up of anti and scorbutic. In other words, it was a chemical that would prevent the onset of disease of scurvy. It's one of the vitamin deficiencies which, untreated, is fatal. Although as far as the navies are concerned, to some extent, yes, it was a fatal disease, but part of the problem was that for many of the men before they died, they had protracted periods of incapacity, so they were unable to work the ship. We know from work done during the Second World War with some volunteers, these were men who were conscientious objectors in prison in Britain and in America, who agreed to participate in a trial to find out how long it would take for symptoms of scurvy to appear if you were fed a diet that was totally deficient in vitamin C. And as you can see there, it takes about 6 weeks for the very first symptoms to appear. In other words, the human body does not contain an enormous reserve of vitamin C. It does need to be replenished constantly through dietary intake. Now, why can we no longer produce vitamin C? I am diverging a little bit here from my topic, but don't worry, we will come back to the Royal Navy. But I thought that would be interesting for an intelligent audience to have some understanding as to why we are in this particular predicament. You don't need to feed vitamin C to your cat or your dog or your farm animals, because they can all produce their own vitamin C. They can produce their ascorbic acid through their internal metabolic pathways. But for some reason, humans cannot produce it. So what went wrong? Well, it turns out we're not alone. It turns out that in fact humans who share the same evolutionary branch as the orangutans, the chimpanzees, the gorillas, we're all on the same evolutionary branch, what are known as the great apes or the tailless monkeys. And all members of that evolutionary branch have the same problem. None of us can actually produce vitamin C by our internal metabolic pathways. There are a few other animal species in the same situation, but the vast majority of animals and plants can produce their own vitamin C via their internal metabolic pathways. But something's gone wrong as far as the great apes or the tailless monkeys, whichever term you wish to use. So of course for them, or for us on that evolutionary branch, dietary intake of vitamin C is essential. And this just outlines what went wrong with humans. I will step away from here just to say that in most animal species, the production of vitamin C, ascorbic acid, starts with glucose, and there's a series of intermediate steps, each of which is controlled by an enzyme, which is responsible for the production of scurvic acid, or vitamin C. And each enzyme is controlled by the template, a gene that's responsible for the template for producing the enzyme. Now what we discovered, what the biochemists have discovered, that when you look at human beings, if you look at the tailless monkeys in general, the problem has been that enzyme 5, in the very last stage of that chain of chemical reactions, enzyme 5 does not work. And enzyme 5 does not work because the gene that controls the production of enzyme 5 mutated. So the mutation means that the enzyme that's produced is no longer active and it cannot control that last step from chemical 5 to ascorbic acid. When you look at all of those other tailless monkeys, they all have exactly the same defect. The same chemical, the same enzyme, the same gene is defective. And the geneticists tell us that that happened about 60 million years ago. Probably the common ancestor of all the tailless apes who have this defect inherited from a single gene defect 60 million years ago. Consequently, we need to have a dietary intake of vitamin C in order to maintain life. I'll just touch on one of the important elements of vitamin C. Why is it essential? There's a number of activities that vitamin C has, but the one I'm going to concentrate on is collagen, the magic tissue that holds us together. You can imagine building a house and miraculously removing all the nails and all the screws. The whole house would fall apart. If you remove the collagen from our bodies would fall apart. The collagen is the integral structure that holds us together. When you imagine the knee joint, for example, powerful joint, the forces that are on it, what holds the two bones together in the knee joint is collagen. What holds our teeth into our jaws is collagen. Not only is collagen incredibly strong, but it's incredibly flexible. There's nothing like it that we can produce, man-made, that can reproduce the sort of abilities or physical attributes of collagen. So that's the background to vitamin C and why we're in the situation that we are, and the situation that navies found themselves in once they started to undertake long protracted voyages with inadequate vitamin C in the diet. Now the British Navy, like all navies, confronted this issue basically by neglect. They just accepted the fact that they were going to lose large numbers of men when they went to sea for protracted periods of time. As far as the Royal Navy is concerned, that was sort of the status quo up until the disastrous voyage of Admiral George Anson. Now, Anson was sent off in 1740 in an expedition against the Spanish in what I would call a Churchillian approach. The idea was to attack the Spanish in their soft underbelly, to use a Churchill phrase, and to do that, instead of attacking the Spanish, with whom, once again, England was at war, this time the War of the Austrian Succession, what they would do was, rather than attacking the Spanish treasure ships in the Atlantic, or perhaps the Mediterranean, or around the Gibraltar, they would sail around Cape Horn and attack them off the western coast of South America and Central America, where the Spaniards would least expect it. And in fact, that's what transpired. So the flotilla that was sent out by the British Navy in 1740 was comprised 6 ships. 2 of them failed to get around Cape Horn because of severe storms. So 4 managed to get around to the western side of South America. 1 ship foundered and was run ashore because of a mutiny. So when they got to Central America, Anson had 3 ships and a crew of 961 men. He had a very successful voyage. The plunder was beyond the dreams of avarice, because indeed the Spanish were not expecting to be attacked there. They had no warships there to protect them. So Anson did extremely well. He then had to get back home. He was concerned that if he went back the way he'd come, the Spanish would be waiting for him. So he decided that the best way to get home would be to continue to sail west, basically to circumnavigate the world across the Pacific and to sneak back to Plymouth, perhaps when the Spanish weren't looking. So it was a long voyage, lots of money, but by the time he got back to England in June 1774, and I will point out he started in 1740, June 1774, he had, that's wrong, I apologise, that's a typing error. It was actually 1770 that he was dispatched. Oh, sorry, I didn't pick that up before. 1770 that he was dispatched, and 4 years later that he returned. He had 1 ship and he only had 335 men. The others had virtually all died from scurvy. The reason he only had 1 ship was he had so many men who either were sick or invalided due to scurvy that he didn't have enough men to work 3 ships. So he had to burn 2 ships to stop them falling into the hands of the Spanish. When he got back to England, the uproar over the loss of men, although I suspect the loss of ships might have been more important, when he got back to England there was absolute uproar in the newspapers, in the Parliament, and the Navy came under incredible pressure, and they of course handed the pressure down to the Navy Sick and Hurt Board to say this has to be stopped. You have to find a solution for this dreadful disease. It was equivalent, I think, to the pressure on the Navy to solve the problem of longitude at sea. As far as the defeat of scurvy is concerned, there are 2 men who deserve all the credit for achieving this outcome. Firstly, Dr. James Lind, member of the Royal College of Physicians of Edinburgh, and Sir Gilbert Blane, Fellow of the Royal Society and Fellow of the Royal College of Physicians of London. Both Scots. Amazing how many successful medical practitioners in the military forces in England at this time were dominated by Scots. A reflection of the fact that the medical education in Edinburgh was outstanding. It was not so good in England. Their 2 universities, Oxford and Cambridge, were busy turning out ministers of religion rather than doctors. So these are the 2 men who we are going to be talking about over much of the rest of the presentation. Now Lind himself was obviously a very smart young man because his parents in Edinburgh managed to convince a well-known Edinburgh surgeon, George Langlands, to take their boy on as a surgical apprentice. And this was how you undertook surgical training at this time. You were signed up to a well-known surgeon and you were indentured, if you like, and you served probably 6 or 8 years. At the end of that time, Dr. Langlands said, well, off you go, here's your certificate, you're now a surgeon. The problem for James Lind was it was a bit hard to get established in practice in Edinburgh as a young man. And he finally decided that the only way he was going to make a living was actually to join the British Navy. And they wouldn't even recognise his surgeon's qualifications. He had to sign on as a surgeon's mate. But by the time he was 31, his true ability had shone through and he was actually appointed a Navy surgeon. But he only stayed in the Navy for another year or 18 months before he left the Navy, undertook physician training, and then eventually became chief physician at the famous Naval Hospital at Portsmouth. We have a painting, a portrait of him here, holding one of the 3 volumes of the famous book that he wrote. Lind not only is famous for his contribution to the treatment of scurvy, but he's famous in medical research circles because Lynn designed the very first prospective randomised trial that was ever published in the literature. And we'll go on to that now. The introduction to his book, and here's a facsimile of the introduction to the first edition, says, armies have been supposed to lose more of their men by sickness than by the sword. But this observation has been much more verified in our fleets and squadrons, where the scurvy alone during the last war proved a more destructive enemy and cut off more valuable lives than the united efforts of the French and Spanish arms. Somewhat analogous to the army, where the great disease, of course, was typhus. So that's the introduction to his book, published in 1753, and that was while he was undergoing physician training in Edinburgh. But what about his famous trial? Over that long period when he was a surgeon's mate, and before he actually became a surgeon, he obviously saw an enormous amount of scurvy. He saw the enormous death roll that it undertook. And during that time, he read as widely as he possibly could on possible treatments of scurvy, its prevention, everything he could find. What we would nowadays call a review of the literature. And that was the genesis of the famous book that he wrote, a treatise on the scurvy in 3 parts. This trial, he was a Navy surgeon, as I mentioned, running for 1 year. He was on HMS Salisbury, 60 guns. And he went to the captain and said, look, he'd like to do some studies on potential treatments for scurvy. Would that be all right? And the captain was very happy with that. So the plan that Lynn had would be they would find on the ship 12 seamen with scurvy of about the same severity. Unfortunately, he had no trouble finding 12 seamen who had scurvy about the same severity. The plan was that they would be treated in the same quarters. They would receive the same diet, but each pair of surgeons, of sailors, would receive one of these treatments. And the reason they would receive one of these treatments was that there were strong proponents for each of these treatments as a method of curing scurvy. So pair 1 got a quarter of cider per day because there were powerful voices saying that cider was the way to cure scurvy. Pair 2 got 25 drops of an elixir of vitriol, which was basically dilute sulfuric acid with some alcohol and some sugar and other things to make it taste palatable. Pair 3 got 2 spoonfuls of vinegar. Again, there were powerful voices saying that vinegar was the cure for scurvy. Another pair 4 got half a pint of seawater a day. Pair 5 received an electry. Now, an electry was a paste that was made of those ingredients, and this paste was applied to the gums and to the tongue. And this seemed to be reasonable because, in fact, the first symptoms of scurvy was, in fact, bleeding gums, loosening of the teeth, and swelling of the tongue. So it seemed reasonable to apply this mixture of paste onto the mouth in order to treat scurvy. And lucky pair 6 drew 2 oranges and a lemon. And the plan was to review them. He would review the seamen after 2 weeks of treatment to see who had benefited from the treatment. Well, you will not be surprised to know, of course, that only pair 6 had fully recovered from their scurvy, so much so that they were able to go straight back to work on the ship. Now, his book does not detail whether all the others were then given citrus juice, but we hope to God that that's what they were given. But this was a very, very powerful study to demonstrate that, in fact, citrus and lemon was a cure for scurvy. We're talking here about 1747. You would think that that would be the end of the argument. It's all pretty straightforward. You might think about sitting there feeling pretty confident, you know, here we are in this modern scientific age, you know, we all understand science, we all understand statistical significance. I just ask you to cast your mind back to COVID. All the misinformation we had. We had the President of the United States saying take bleach. There was a proposal that you could treat something if your dog, if your sheep have got liver flu. There was something, an anti-parasitic that was being paddled around. So don't forget, we're not that far away from the from the confusion that was still there in 1740. Just think, a few years ago we had exactly the same situation with COVID in a modern society. Now, I mentioned that he recommended these treatments on the basis of work that had been published by particularly naval physicians and surgeons in the past. You would think that that would be enough to answer the question as to what was the appropriate treatment for scurvy. But there was a lot of confusion, and this confusion was borne out in his own book of what was the difference between prevention of scurvy and treatment of scurvy. All right then, if you're going to give citrus juice to treat scurvy, shouldn't we not worry about that? What we need to concentrate on is how do we prevent scurvy? That's the important thing, prevention. If we do prevention, we won't need to worry about treatment. And this confusion, of course, is apparent in Lynn's book. But there was lots of confounding factors. And when physicians and surgeons working with the Navy looked at the ships to say, well, what's going on here? What's actually causing this scurvy problem? The first thing they looked at, and what was obvious, was the officers had relatively infrequent episodes of scurvy, and most of the disease burden was actually borne by the ordinary seamen. So when you looked at the naval officers, what did you find? Well, they were housed in beautiful dry quarters, they had a cot, they didn't have wet bedding, they had fresh air. There was the captain in that beautiful galley at the back with floor-to-ceiling windows and lots of fresh air coming through. And look at these poor seamen. They had 18 inches of space. They were right next to each other. The bedding was always wet. There was moist sea air, stagnant air below decks, what they call devitiated air. All these men so crammed in so closely together that the air had had all the vital forces taken out of it. There was a recognition that maybe lack of vegetables and greens might have been a factor, but really all these other things were the problem that was causing, and they had to be addressed first before you were going to have to worry about treating scurvy. If you addressed these issues, that wouldn't matter. If you've read the Aubrey Maturin novels, which I have twice in their entirety, they're a fascinating insight into naval life during the Napoleonic Wars, a bit later than we're talking about here. But what's obvious in those books, and when they looked at what actually has gone on with the relative sparing of officers, the officers took much of their own food with them. They took their own hens with them so that they would have fresh eggs. Captain Cook's nanny goat circumnavigated the world twice with him before it was put out to pasture in Greenwich. And he obviously liked fresh milk. A bit of milk in his tea, I suppose, or with his wheat bix in the morning. So if you've got hens that are producing your own eggs, if you've got a nanny goat, or they shipped cows as well, cattle with them, there was plenty of source of vitamin C for the officer class. The poor ordinary seamen didn't have the sort of funding nor the space in order to provide their own food. So that confusion led to a lot of difficulty in trying to understand why scurvy had this disparate incidence of disease between the ordinary seaman and the officer class, and the way they were housed was seen as the important issue. They missed the dietary connection entirely. There was another problem with Lynn's advice. Lynn realised, having been a naval officer, that there's no way that the British Navy was going to send their ships out with several tonnes of oranges and lemons. They'd all go putrid within the first month anyway, so there wouldn't be much use. So he came up with the idea of concentrating the fruit juice, what was called rob. And what they did was you took the juice, put them in big copper pans and simmered it for several hours in order to concentrate the juice to produce something like a syrup, and that was called rob. The problem is, of course, we know now that prolonged simmering destroyed all the vitamin C that was in there. Unfortunately, Lynn didn't repeat his trial using rob and compare it with citrus juice. That might have helped, but I think we have to say in retrospect that Lynn perhaps didn't fully appreciate the real scientific strength of that study which he had done. The other problem with the citrus recommendation was that West Indies limes have relatively low doses of vitamin C compared with lemons. Now the British, to get hold of lemons, had to deal with the Mediterranean countries where lemons were grown, like Spain, the dreaded enemy, Italy, which was fragile states all over the place, difficult to know who to deal with. On the other hand, Britain had all these colonies in the Caribbean that were growing limes. Why not we just use limes? Hence, you might say, the reason why British naval personnel were known as limeys, because they were decided, right, much cheaper, we own the colonies, we're going to send them off with limes. So when British ships arrived in the Caribbean, they revictualled before they went up to sail up the west coast or the east coast of North America, suffered the same occurrence of scurvy. Not as bad, but they still had scurvy. So that again brought the citrus story into doubt. Of course, the problem we know now is, as I mentioned, limes have a much lower level of vitamin C in them compared with lemons and oranges. So lots of confusion. Of course, the Naval Sick and Hurt Board went to those valuable physicians in London, the College of Physicians, and asked for their advice on what they would recommend in order to prevent scurvy. And they came back and said, listen, we reckon that wine vinegar would be superior to acid fruits. You can see this idea of acidity going through their mind. They're all trying to look for something acid. They think this is the magic solution to it is acid. That's all they knew. So they suggested that wine vinegar would be better, a lot cheaper as well. As a bit of a throw-in, they said to the Sick and Hurt Board, and they said, by the way, we think it'd be a good idea if you stop using sea salt for food preservation. Now, unfortunately, it wasn't until the end of the 1800s that refrigeration was discovered, and the wiseacres from the College of Physicians did not make a recommendation as what was the alternative to using salt. And as you know, in the Middle Ages and in Europe, the salt trade was enormous. Massive amounts of salt were traded across Europe, all predominantly for preservation of food. It was the only way of doing it before refrigeration was available. And I did mention that in Lynn's trial, one of the pairs of people did get vinegar. And he did put that in there because of this advice that had come through from James Lind. The other problem, of course, is there were lots of other people who had the ear of the Sick and Hurt Board, all of whom had their own favourite treatment that they thought should be used. And so the Sick and Hurt Board had some information coming in from James Lind, but there were all these other people bombarding them with their advice. Again, I'm reminded of COVID. Richard Mead, who had the additional imprimatur of being physician of King George III, had written an influential book, A Discourse on the Scurvy, in 1749. And he described it, he said, listen, scurvy is due to the putrid air below decks. There's nothing you can do about it. That's just the way it is. You know, you go to sea, you get scurvy, you die. That's how it is. William Coburn, an ex-naval surgeon, very wealthy physician subsequently, but he'd written a very influential book called Sea Diseases, and that was on the shelf of every naval surgeon for many decades after his death in 1739. Such was the influence of this man, and it was he who recommended that lectuary, that paste to go in the mouth and on the gums. So that was why it was in Lynn's trial. And there were all sorts of other people, James, Lynn, Douglas, and the reason they were peddling their nostrums was that if you could convince the Navy that this treatment would be what you need for scurvy, riches would ensue. They could stamp their product saying it was recommended by the Royal Navy. Money would fly in the window. They would be so successful. So again, the Sick and Hurt Board constantly being bombarded by all these people claiming to have a cure for scurvy. Okay, now perhaps the most influential voice that was listened to by the Sick and Hurt Board was David McBride. Now McBride was a very smooth-talking Ulsterman. I think he must have kissed the Blarney Stone on several occasions, and he somehow really did get the ear of the Sick and Hurt Board. And in 1764 he wrote a pamphlet which has got the longest name of any pamphlet I've ever heard of, an historical account of a new method of treating scurvy, etc., etc. Now what McBride was peddling was wort, which was basically a malt extract. And that was good because England grew a lot of barley, which you make malt from, and they grew barley, of course, for producing beer. And as far as that appealed to the British Sick and Hurt Board because they would be able to buy they had barley in England, not have to buy it from an overseas country, and this would be wonderful if it was the cure of scurvy. The reason he recommended this was that he spoke to his brother, who was the captain of a British naval vessel, and said to his brother, look, I want you to try this malt extract, this wort, to see whether it's going to cure scurvy. And his brother did, in fact, give it to 10 seamen and wrote to his brother and said, look, it did seem to be sort of beneficial. And on the basis of that, McBride then went in hard with the Second Herb Board to recommend that they should be using wort. He gained support from some very influential voices in London, including Sir John Pringle, who was a physician advisor to the Army and the Navy, John Hunter, who was a famous surgeon scientist, and Henry Tom, who himself was actually a member of the Second Herb Board. The captains who were given wort by the Navy to trial reported that it really didn't seem to do anything. But despite that, the Navy continued to issue wort right into the 1780s. Now, I actually prepared this presentation, much shorter version, for a meeting at the College of Surgeons about 4 years ago. And when I was asked by my colleagues what I was going to be talking about, I said I was going to be talking about the defeat of scurvy. Oh, they said, oh, Captain Cook, he was the one who defeated scurvy. Well, is that really what the historical record shows? In fact, a couple of people tonight mentioned, as soon as I mentioned scurvy, Captain Cook followed immediately afterwards. Cook has a well-earned reputation as a captain who cared for his men on his 3 great voyages of discovery. But scurvy did occur on his ships. Now, the death rate was very low. In fact, there probably were no deaths from scurvy, but scurvy did still occur. In part because he took so much care of his men. Before he set sail each year on each of his exploration voyages, he stocked up with sauerkraut. And sauerkraut is preserved by a process of fermentation which does preserve vitamin C, unlike boiling, which was to produce raw, did not do. So he was shipping material that did have some vitamin C in it. He always took on board lots of green vegetables. He obviously had some insight that this had a role to play. Whenever he made landfall, he always purchased fresh fruit and vegetables. As he was passing through the Straits of Magellan, he put crew onto the island of Terra del Fuego to pick what was called scurvy grass and wild celery. Now, we don't really know what they were, but he obviously had some insight that they were beneficial for the crew. And whenever he made landfall, as he was sailing through the Pacific, the same thing. He always bought fresh fruit and vegetables. And so the incidence of scurvy, as I say, on his ships was actually very, very low. He was given wort to try. Unfortunately, perhaps his scientific bent was more with cartography than it was with medicine. And his naval surgeons perhaps were not of quite the same mindset as Lind. But Cook, as I say, was probably not a good ship in order to assess prevention of scurvy, because all the things that he did actually helped to reduce the incidence of scurvy anyway. Now, I mentioned my colleagues who said, oh, well, Cook, scurvy, that's understandable. That's a very common idea, I think, in people's mind, that Cook was central to the discovery of how to defeat scurvy. But I was surprised to find this statement in the well-known book, The Tyranny of Distance, written by Professor Geoffrey Blainey. And Blainey writes in the book, Cook had also shown that lemon juice, sauerkraut, malt, carrot marmalade and other concoctions were a preventative of scurvy on long voyages. Now, I think we have to question many of those statements. The Navy was not issuing lemon juice in the time when Cook was undertaking his voyages of exploration. Sauerkraut, yes, we know it does contain some vitamin C. We know malt contains absolutely no vitamin C. I don't know what carrot marmalade is, but when my wife is making marmalade, she boils it for an hour. So I can't imagine there'd be any vitamin C left if that's the same way that you make carrot marmalade. And as for the statement, other concoctions, I have no idea what Blaney is talking about in terms of defeating scurvy with, quote, other concoctions. Geoffrey Blaney's book, a well-known history book about how the distance of Australia from Europe had a significant impact on its history. The book is also heavily referenced, but this statement has no references to it whatsoever. So I'm not quite sure where he got this information from, but it is entirely wrong. We know that he had scurvy on his boat because of Joseph Banks. Now Banks, as you know, was on with Cook on the first great exploration, and in his diary, as they're crossing the western end of the Pacific Ocean, Banks notes in his diary that he developed bleeding gums, loose teeth and a swollen tongue. And he diagnosed that in fact he had the first signs of scurvy. And in the diary he says, having diagnosed the scurvy, I flew to the sauerkraut. After a week of sauerkraut, his symptoms continued to deteriorate. He then describes taking wort, and his symptoms continued to get worse. But then, somebody in Aussie had a word to him before he left and recommended he should take Dr. Evans' mixture with him. Now, Dr. Evans was a well-known physician in Edinburgh who obviously agreed with the work of Lind. And Dr. Evans' mixture was basically lemon juice in brandy. Now, the alcohol preserved it, but it did not destroy the vitamin C. And Banks described in his diary that his symptoms resolved within a week of having taken Dr. Evans' mixture. Now, Banks was an extremely influential person in London. If he had published his diaries within a year or two of getting back from that first great circumnavigation with Cook, I have no doubt that the Navy Sick and Herd Board would have been forced to acknowledge the fact that lemon juice was responsible for curing Banks's scurvy. Banks was very dilatory. He never published his diaries. In fact, they were not published until 1896, and of course not by him, by somebody else, 100 years after scurvy had been defeated. But so this whole issue could have all been sorted out in 1774 if he had cared to write up his diaries when he got back from that first voyage of exploration. John Pringle, I mentioned in passing, I won't go into detail, but another influential voice who was opposed to Rob, and he felt that it didn't work, but he was opposed to Rob because he was a very good friend of Cook. And Cook had said to him, and there's a letter on file, this is Cook's letter to Pringle just before Cook left on that third last fateful voyage. I entirely agree with you that the dearness of Rob of lemon and oranges will hinder them being furnished in large quantities. I do not think this is so necessary, for though they may assist other things, I have no great opinion of them alone. So that was why Pringle, who had the ear of the king, he was a medical advisor to both the Navy and to the Army, was saying, well, Rob's useless, and that's quite right, Rob was useless. So what happened to change the Navy's mind? Well, this man, Gilbert Blaine, the second of the two people we're going to be talking about today. Blaine was a thin-lipped, rather sour lowland Scot who made good in the south of England. In fact, his nickname behind his back was Chill, Chill Blaine. He was obviously a very hard man to get on with, but he was the man who really nailed the story with regards to citrus juice and scurvy. He had a meteoric rise through the Navy's medical establishment. He was actually initially appointed as personal physician to Admiral Lord Rodney. Rodney was what's described as the valetudinarian, what we would now call hypochondriac. and he always had his own personal physician travelling with him, and in this case Gilbert Blaine was obviously recommended for the job as they sailed across the Atlantic to the Caribbean. The other captains in the flotilla accompanying Lord Rodney were so impressed by Blaine that they pressured him to appoint Blaine as physician to the fleet. Now Blaine was perhaps a very unusual individual. He was industrious, forceful, but more particularly he was a statistician. A very rare accomplishment at this time. We're talking late 1740s, late 1780s. And once he was looking after all of the seamen on the whole flotilla, using statistical analysis, he realised that scurvy was nothing to do with the wet bedding or damp sea air. He realised that it was due to a defect of nourishment. He also realised from his statistical analysis that malt and rob were useless. It was due to a defect of nourishment, and in a letter that he wrote to a friend in London, he says, quote, "Citrus juice works like what is vulgarly called a charm." He wrote a long memorandum to the Navy Sick and Hurt Board, and it's on file in London. Never responded to, possibly even never read. Nothing happened. However, where are we? Down here. Here we are, down here. A fateful date, 1795, he was appointed to the Navy Sick and Hurt Board. John Pringle had died about 10 years beforehand, and now Chill Blaine ruled the roost. He prevailed upon his good friend, Peter Rainier, who was being sent out this time to the East India Station to take over, to ship appropriate quantities of lemon and lime juice, with instructions that it was to be administered to every member of the crew under direct supervision of the officers. And the officers were to take it first. That was the only way that he could be sure that every member of the crew would in fact get or take scurvy, take a lemon and orange juice concoction. He was able to report to the Navy and the Sick and Hurt Board that after a 19-week voyage, he arrived in Madras without a single case of scurvy. This was unheard of. 19 weeks at sea, they'd never made landfall and not a single case of scurvy. The Sick and Hurt Board's hand was finally forced, and they had to accept that citrus juice was absolutely essential in order to prevent and to treat scurvy. By 1904, the Admiralty were issuing the equivalent of 227,000 litres of citrus juice to the serving naval personnel. In 1805, the First Lord of the Admiralty, visiting the Naval Hospital at Portsmouth, asked if he could see a seaman with scurvy. He was told there was no such case in the hospital, and so scurvy was defeated. So these two men were responsible, therefore, for defeating scurvy. The interesting thing is that other European countries refused to believe it. The French in particular did not believe that something supposedly discovered by the English could possibly be true. It has been suggested that one of the contributing factors to the success of the Battle of Trafalgar was not just the brilliance of the military and naval manoeuvres by the Admiral, but also that the French crews were weakened by the continuing episode of scurvy. I might add the British East India Company also refused to issue citrus juice because it would reduce the dividends to their shareholders. So again, it took a long time for this story to actually percolate throughout all of the seafaring nations of Western Europe. The reason that I've concentrated on the British Navy is because it was the British Navy that was actually responsible for finding the cure and introducing the method of preventing scurvy and subsequently saving the lives of further thousands and thousands of men. To this day, the insignia of the Royal Navy's Institute of Naval Medicine depicts a lemon tree in acknowledgement of the work of Lind in preventing scurvy in the British Navy. Thank you for your attention. One of the common questions I've been asked, and I have presented this to a number of Probus groups as well, although I must say for the Probus groups I left out the detail about the genetic defects, I have to say. But one of the questions I've often asked is, what about the Eskimos?
Yeah.
Good question.
Yeah.
Well, the first thing to say is the Eskimo don't get scurvy. Now, of course, plant material is not the only source of vitamin C. Meat is also a source. And of course the Eskimos eat whale and seal, and provided you don't overcook it, there is still adequate vitamin C there. So if you eat it like sushi, for example, or what we call steak tartare, there's still plenty of vitamin C in there, and that's probably the reason why the Eskimo do not get scurvy. The other question I've been asked also is why there were so many men on these ships. If you looked at the staffing, the manpower is required to sail these naval vessels, and you compared it with, for example, how many sailors there were in, say, the merchant marine, the merchant fleets, the naval vessels had an enormous amount of men on them. And the reason for that was, I discovered after doing some research, was a 16-pound cannon required a crew of 8 just to work the cannon. Not just to bring up all the cartridges, to bring up the powder and bring up the cannonballs. A 32-pound gun required 10 men just to work the gun. So if you had a 50-gun ship, which is 25 guns a side, and you want to fight both sides of the ship, let's just say there's an average of, let's say, 8 men per gun. 50-gun ships, work it out, 5 8 to 40, nearly 500 men, not to sail the ship, but just to work the guns. And that was why they had such enormous complements of it, because they were naval vessels. And the merchant marine vessels certainly did not need anywhere near that, because they were basically just sailing the vessel. Well, 2 questions, I've already answered them. Is that enough? Is that not? Yes, one at the back, yes, sir.
When the Navy, prior to refrigeration in England, started sending thousands of litres of lemon and orange juice, how did they preserve it on the ships?
Well, they were. You remember, Lynn realised that, in fact, Lynn was of the view that you'd be taking the oranges and lemons with you. In other words, you'd have a big hole just full of the fruit, and that would all get perished in no time. But when what the Navy was doing was actually squeezing the lemons and oranges, the juice, and they were contained in steel, not stainless steel, what do we call it, pig iron, not stainless steel tanks, but it was stored in tanks and glass carboys, and it did not go off. It didn't need a preservative. Provided it was looked after appropriately, it did not deteriorate. Mightn't have tasted so good after 17 weeks, but it still had the vitamin C in it, which was the critical factor.
I heard recently that scurvy was making a way back in some...
Just a moment now. My wife would say that I'm hard of hearing. I would say I'm deaf. So let's just try that again.
I heard recently that scurvy was making its way back because of poor nutrition in some countries.
Scurvy, as I mentioned, all you need is 6 weeks with no vitamin C, and scurvy will start to appear. So if a diet is deficient in vitamin C, you don't take vitamin C tablets, scurvy will reappear. Yeah. It's always there. I mean, and as I mentioned, there's no store. We don't have a store of vitamin C. It's 6 weeks, that's it. One of the trials that was done with those conscientious objectives, the trial that the British actually did, they looked at preloading the people with vitamin C, high dose vitamin C, before they were divided into 2 groups. And they went a bit longer. If you had a bigger dose, if the body was saturated with vitamin C, then it took sort of an extra month, I think, before the symptoms first appeared. But if you're just an ordinary person, got on the ship, normal vitamin C level beforehand, 6 weeks, the teeth would start to loosen and start to get bleeding from the gums. Old wounds would reopen. You know, most wounds were healed by scar tissue, and scar tissue was collagen. And so, you know, sailors who'd had a healed below-knee amputation 20 years ago, the amputation stuck reopen. Old wounds from cannon shot and so on would reopen, amputations would reopen, because the collagen just falls apart without vitamin C there to part of the constant turnover.
Well, I think I heard that there were also outbreaks of scurvy on some of the Antarctic exploration.
Yeah, well, right. Well, again, if there's no fresh plant food, but there was.
You think they'll be prepared?
What's his name? Scott.
Scott.
Captain Scott did not believe that scurvy was due to a deficiency of vitamin C. He believed it was due to eating tinned food. And he had issues with scurvy because he did not believe that fresh fruit and vegetables were required. And where he got this idea from that tinned food was the problem, but you know, I go back to COVID. You know, there's always people with odd ideas, and of course, unfortunately, in Scott's, he was head of the expedition to get to the South Pole. Yeah.
Have there been any recorded cases of scurvy in the Australian Defence Force?
In
the ADF, Australian Defence Force, has there been any recorded cases?
I don't know. Surely not.
I just wonder about Gallipoli, protracted campaign.
I think
Troops isolated, where did
I
supplies
don't know whether they're just living on bully beef and sort of what was ordinary naval food. One would have expected that by then there was an understanding of what the cause of scurvy was, and that they were able to get sufficient quantities of appropriate fruit and vegetables to them. I'm not aware of anything that I've read. I've not read voluminously about Gallipoli, but I've certainly not read anything about scurvy as being a factor in Gallipoli.
Talking about scars and amputation, so if you start taking vitamin C again, does the gums just start growing back? I mean, there's no effect.
No, the teeth, the collagen is laid down, the teeth become firm, and Banks describes all of this in his diary, that having gone on to Dr. Evans' mixture, his teeth were back firm in his gums, the loose teeth stopped, the bleeding to the gums stopped. And the reason for the bleeding is that I mentioned that collagen is this magic structure. All of our blood vessels have an outer casing, if you like, of collagen that provides structural integrity to the blood vessel. And so what was happening is that as that collagen broke down from around the blood vessels, they became fragile. And so eating, just the trauma from eating food, particularly hard naval food, the trauma from eating was enough to cause disruption to the capillaries, so they started getting bleeding from the gums. Again, it was a loss of collagen that was underlying that.
And cuts and that just heal up again, as if nothing had happened.
I haven't read that. I mean, you're below
Well,
the
I'm just trying to
amputation
work out
stuff. I think it would have to be researched. I think your amputation
No, I was just fascinated. I read the book, Canson's book. It's fascinating.
Yes, sir.
Coming back to Scott, the fact that he chose not to have any vitamin C on board.
Who?
Scott.
Scott, yes.
He would have then certainly been one of those to have contracted the scurvy. How did he then explain away the fact that he didn't need it and that just his tin food was going to prevent it?
Well, they were getting, once they got down there, they were harvesting seabirds, they were fishing, they had other sources. They didn't realise this, but they had other sources of vitamin C intake, of which he was either ignorant or chose not to believe, and stuck to this idea that it was tinned meat was the underlying issue. But it's the fact that provided the meat is, I mean, even if you cook a barbecue, you know, a steak on a barbecue, the outside might be cooked, but we like our steak rare in the middle, still with a bit of red coming out of it. all the vitamin C in that level, that layer is still going to be there. It's not going to be broken down.
And that's why a squeeze of lemon on top of the steak afterwards is so good for you.
Absolutely. That's the more important bit. I'm not quite sure how the red wine ties in there, but I'm sure that.
And that's why I'm a flavourist.
Yes.
And what about the garlic? I would have thought garlic in that elixir that they tried, wouldn't that have vitamin C?
Not enough. It was
Not
a paste
enough.
that contained a whole lot of ingredients in which there was a relative full, and you didn't ingest it necessarily. But just on that story, there is, in terms of great ocean voyages, the Chinese were making long distance voyages.
Well, the
We go way back, even earlier.
1472 or whatever, the 1472 voyage that they took from China and supposedly landed in Australia,
Yes.
they were actually growing things on board
Well,
ship apparently, like bean
what's actually
sprouts.
realised in terms of the cause, what prevented what was believed to be the reason why the Chinese doing their big voyages around the Pacific didn't get it, was because they shipped a lot of root ginger as part of their food. And the flash cooking technique, cooking what we call a wok nowadays, that doesn't destroy the vitamin C in the same way. But it was the root ginger that they took with them as part of their ordinary culinary experience is thought to be the reason why, and it has had that root ginger does contain a high level of vitamin C, but why the Chinese did not experience problems with scurvy with protracted voyages.
And my other question is, as I feel very guilty as an ex-Australian history teacher, indoctrinating my students at Year 8 with the fact that Cook actually proved that, scurvy could be...
You're in good company. It's a very common misconception.
I know, but I also believe they had onions.
Well,
you
Geoffrey
didn't mention
Blaney had the same view. I just got a quote from page 15. When I was reading the book...
Well, the history, the Tyranny of Distance was the textbook for Year 12 Australian history. Not that we did the Cook voyages so much, but, we talked about other things.
But Cook, as I was saying, it was what, 1795 before the final evidence was there from that Rainier trip. So anything happening before then did not really have anything strongly in favour of it, apart from individual practitioners who believed the Lynn story. But anything else that was being issued by the Navy Second Herd Board actually had no therapeutic value whatsoever.
Second Herd Board. Yes, great. Gosh, thank
Sorry
you.
to disappoint you.
Yes.
I have to contact all those students who and say, oops, mea culpa.
Sorry, maybe
Jeffrey
I'll
Blaney
teach
and I
them to
will-
go and read a book.
Yes, sir.
I'm not certain, but I expect the prisoners of the war of the Japanese in Malaya, etc., with a severe shortage of rations that were imposed on those prisoners, caused them to develop many diseases as well as killed many of them. And I expect, I don't know for sure, but I expect scurvy was one of the diseases.
It was. They had multi-deficiency disease. But then the major deficiency that they suffered from, which was beriberi, which is due to lack of vitamin B complex, was a much more powerful, distressing disease. But they had, you're right, they had the whole shooting match were all deficient in the diet. And they were eating polished rice, as you know, which was the major factor. They've been reading brown rice, things may well have been better. But it was polished rice was part of the issue there, certainly with the beriberi story.
And in terms of our modern era, the promotion of fruits and vegetables in the Australian setting, because a lot of Australians aren't so good at their fruit and veggies.
Yes.
That's the reason for your 7-a-day programs of the 2 fruit and 5 veg. Same thing, different voices or different organisations at different times. But that is the reason for both the 2 fruit, 5 veg and 7-a-day promotions in supermarkets and elsewhere.
Exactly. But I mean, when I was growing up, my mother, boiled the cabbage, she boiled the vegetables arrived on your plate almost like a puree. I mean, they're really boiled out. And my father, hated, I was telling my good friend Peter over here, my father died last year at 101. But when he came to our place for dinner, he didn't want the broccoli al dente, or the peas al dente, he wanted them boiled, they couldn't be soft.
Because that's
When you grow up,
the custody
with all the vitamin and carbs that was up in the air, they were all broken down. It was in the water. You tipped down the sink would have been more nutritious than what you've got out of the broccoli or the cauliflower. Exactly, that's what he
We
was
survive. We
Any more?
Thank God for that.
Campbell, thank you.
Thank you very much for that. You're all stated
Thank you.
wonderfully. I think that's right.